this silly little curvy line? That's my blood. That's my sweat. That's my tears. And I will fight day and night to protect the honor of my beloved Lasso tool. With that swear on my grave, my name is Solcani. Here's how to use it. Did you know that if you stick around till the end of my videos, you can get access to freebies and extra content, including the PSD file I used for the drawing in the thumbnail? You should do that. Anyway, much more than a mere selection tool, the Lasso tool is my muse. I've used it in every drawing for the past 4 years, and you should too. So where do you start? First thing I usually start with in drawing is the sketch, but I've always found this to be rather difficult. Coming up with dynamic and unique poses can be challenging enough without a reference, but when you try to find one, it can take as long as the drawing itself. Not optimal. So one technique I like to use is making silhouettes instead of sketches first. By focusing on just the silhouette, I don't stress about getting the anatomy correct on the first try or making the details look nice. It stops me from thinking about any of that because it's not there. All you get is a general shape, which makes it even more important for it to be distinct. When all you have is the silhouette, it becomes much easier to focus on adding interesting shapes and unique poses. You focus on telling a story, an action, or a movement with your work. You can see me do this while brainstorming thumbnails for an old commission from 2023. I like adding values quickly with an airbrush because it helps me understand what my piece will look like before I get to coloring. Using this technique, you can also push out of drawing the same things over and over again. You'll become more aware of your tendency to do the same things repeatedly because it's so simplified. One technique I use to come up with ideas is picking a random song and basing a silhouette on what that song makes me feel. It gives me ideas to draw quickly and also cuts through my perfectionism. A good combo for the busy artist. I also use the Lasso tool a lot for doing my flats. I hate doing flats. It always seems to take longer than it has to. That's probably mostly because I get distracted, but I like to blame it on my brushes. I keep my stabilizers low overall, but most of my brushes have at least a little. That means the longer a line I make, the more it'll lag and slow down behind me for that smoothing effect. When drawing a furry with a ton of markings, this is really inconvenient. So eventually, I started coloring with the Lasso tool. I should mention that not all lassos are made equal, and I don't use this method on every program. Paint Tool Sci, for example, does not have additive selections with the Lasso tool, so I can't make several selections at once, making the whole process a lot slower. Clip Studio Paint, on the other hand, has a very customizable Lasso tool, which I love. I always color in it, even though I usually sketch in Sci. Anyway, here's how I color. The first way is haphazardly filling the whole thing with a giant brush and then carving out what is outside of the lines with Ctrl and X. Make your selection, Ctrl X to erase overflows, and move on. This is significantly faster than using an eraser because the Lasso tool is 0 pixels wide, so you don't need to keep changing your brush to erase large areas and then changing it back to get between those small lines. You do everything at once without having to move your pen over to alter the settings. It might sound like a shorter amount of time, but it saves hours in the long run. The other way is similar and uses the same strategies, but instead of cutting to erase, I just fill with the Lasso tool from the start. It depends on what the drawing is and what I think will be faster, but both methods are pretty effective and interchangeable. I tend to fill from the start if the shape is simpler and there won't be so many small details. Combine these techniques with the Magic Wand tool to cut through a ton of bulky art time. Okay, so I wanted to show off how I use the Lasso tool for effects because if you look hard enough, it's in pretty much every one of my drawings. So I figured I'd just show a couple examples from like 2023 to 2025 of different ways I've used it to add to my drawings, so yeah. The first case scenario is backgrounds. I use the Lasso tool a lot for backgrounds. Quickly adding shapes with it allows me to focus on the general impression and texture you get from it instead of stressing about the details. I tend to also form leading lines with my shapes so that your eyes are pulled back into the focus of my piece. You can also blur shapes to add quick foregrounds or embed them everywhere into your drawing to just give it that extra touch. Adding abstract shapes is something that I do a lot, sometimes accented with gradients. I love adding gradients onto selections. There's something so satisfying about the way they interact, especially if you cross them over in blending layers. You'll see me do this in my demo a lot. I love to use the tool to just make big, bold shapes that show throughout the piece, even if they don't really have a reason to exist. I guess it's kind of a messy method, but I find it adds a lot of intrigue and color depth to my pieces. I like to have a lot of color variation. I think it makes everything a little bit more interesting. You'll also see me use the Lasso tool to add shadows, highlights, really anywhere I can fit it. Okay, with that out of the way, here's the demo. You're gonna see I'm putting a lot of focus into just establishing the kind of color palette that I want. Soul is obviously super vibrant, has a really bright palette, so I want to be thinking about how I'm gonna balance that with this, overall look. I did want it to be pretty colorful. I think that's one of the strengths of using like the Lasso tool with blending modes to get interesting effects. It can be very colorful. So you see that I just like layer a bunch of color burn. I think there's some multiply layers, probably some linear burns in there too. You can look it in the PSD file, which you can get, by the way. But I layer them on top, I add some airbrushing, I combine it with, maybe one or two brushes up until the end. Like, there's really a long amount of time where I'm just building and building and building on several, colors and essentially getting any color that I would want to use in the future in the piece now. I think it helps a lot for color cohesion if you just establish what's going to be there, and then instead of constantly picking new colors, I usually just recycle ones that are already in my piece. Like you can see that for the ambient lighting on Soul, I used the blue that's in the lake. I just like that, it pulls it back in and it makes everything feel very cohesive. Obviously for like a lot of the time in this drawing, it feels very unpolished. And I do find that with the Lasso tool, unless you're pretty subtle about it, it can look, overdone. So I counteract this sometimes by just working on making it subtle, and other times I'll focus on cleaning it up with whatever brushes or rendering that I do after the fact. The sketch for this piece was also done with the Lasso tool, no surprise. I explained it earlier, but I like to add values and just shapes and backgrounds with it. I did do the character line art first and the character sketch first, but after that, it was pretty much all Lasso tool except for like some mild lines. Honestly, just combine things however it works for you. If it works for you, nothing else really matters. And you can see that I use that just to make sure that my composition is steady. Although I don't really love how this one turned out, it is a good tool to, frame your piece and figure out what you want to be in light and what you want to be in dark. And having that stuff set up earlier it'll give you a really strengthened piece, because a lot of people don't really think about, their composition, values, such and so, and if you do, it'll put you ahead of the game. But yeah, that's pretty much how I use the Lasso tool in this piece. And yeah, see you guys in a bit when I tell you about my little additional surprise. The PSD file in full-length speedpaint will be available for free on my Ko-fi. It'll be linked in the description below, so go check it out. You can judge me for how many layers I use. Anyways, go try out the Lasso tool. It's fun and messy, and it's incredibly up my alley. So, @me on Twitter if you make something with it. My username is soul_canny, linked in the description below. If you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. There's more content like this on the way, and I always strive to give tips that are actionable and can help you immediately. Anyways, that's all from me, so thanks for watching.